Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome for you're welcome for sticking around. I thank you. It's great to see some people still there. We're going to be talking about gold's relationship with climate change, decarbonization of gold. Professor Saleem Ali's already been introduced. I'd like to say what a privilege it is to share the stage with him. For those of you who don't know, he's something of a superstar in environmental science, so I consider myself very honored to be here. I'm John Mulligan, as you've heard. I could sometimes describe myself as the old man of the World Gold Council. Been around for probably a bit longer than John Reed. And I often mention that because I started in investment and asset allocation, but over the last decade, my career has pivoted towards sustainability and specifically, more recently on climate change. And I mention that because I think it's a pivot which represents how the supply chain is also showing an awareness of these externalities. And by externalities, I think that's important because this morning we spoke about responsible sourcing. And responsible sourcing is kind of a supply chain getting its house in order. But when we start to look at the world beyond the market, there are these big systemic risks. And so for those of you who are investment focused and think, well, climate change, it's all about the environment, it's all about sustainability. Yes, it is. It's also about systemic risk. Asset valuations will change, supply chains will be heavily disrupted. Your world will not be the same in 10 years as it is today, and I think that's key because of climate change. So we're going to be talking about those big issues. I've, as I say, dedicated some time to looking at this. I'm with an expert too, so we may get deep in the weeds. We have spent, as I say, 5 years looking specifically, first of all, at gold's carbon footprint. When you look at detail about where the emissions come from, it's gold mining, and quite significantly, it's an energy story, but we can talk about that. But let's start with that. Basically, gold's carbon footprint is a mining story, and I wondered if there's a key aspect, a key technology maybe, or that you think is going to be driving that decarbonization going forward.
Yes, thank you, John, for the generous introduction. First of all, I'd also like to note and thank DMCC for supporting a report which we have done on this topic. And we have a draft of this report for those of you who are interested available. I want to also recognize my PhD student who is with us here, Shage Jamal Ameli, who really did all the hard work, and she deserves all the credit. So she's right there in the audience as well. Please do stand up, Shage. We often don't recognize our students. It's very important that we do. And I want to especially thank Sudesh Nambiat for supporting students' work in this regard. Now, with regard to the report, and the Gold Council has really done some fantastic baseline studies on this. And what we've tried to do is synthesize some of the recent literature from the peer-reviewed journals and areas which might not be in just the industry discourse to bring out some further technologies in this arena. So yes, mining definitely is the major source in terms of whether we think about scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. For those of you who are not familiar with the way carbon accounting is done, and it's really important for Dubai this month and within the next few weeks, the world's largest gathering of climate change experts and policymakers will be happening in Dubai, the COP28 meeting at the Expo Center. So it's very timely that we talk about this here. The scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, just to make sure you all understand, scope 1 emissions are the ones which are directly related to the production of a particular entity. Scope 2 have to do with the energy sources which go into that production. And then scope 3 are the derivative downstream uses of the product. And in this regard, clearly, scope 1 emissions with reference to mining is significant, but if you then go into scope 2, which is the energy sources, That's the more interesting part, because gold mining uses such a vast range of energy sources, and that's where a lot of the innovation is happening. So you're right, John, absolutely about the mining, but I think it's important to tease out the scope 1 and 2 emissions in that regard. And I hope even those of you who are gold traders and so on, you will feel it valuable to educate yourselves about this, because whether you like it or not, it's going to be in the lexicon of your day-to-day work. So glad that you're joining.
Thank you. You're absolutely right about this significance of energy. Gold mining is quite unusual from a mining industry point of view, because it often generates its own energy, and often in places where there is no other alternative. So if you're a miner of a bulk or industrial metal, you may be plugged into the local grid. But with gold mining, you may be in a very remote place, and gold mining can operate in very remote places because it does not need the infrastructure of other mining. Is there anything around that energy technology that you think is significant, particularly looking forward to decarbonization?
Yes, so, with reference to also, since we had a discussion earlier about artisanal and small-scale gold mining as well as large-scale gold mining, there are innovations possible across the board, especially for ASM in very remote areas. There are a lot of new efforts being made where it's off-the-grid technologies to help the miners there. ASM emissions at mining are generally about 1/3 of large-scale mining, but there are other concerns with reference to deforestation, which can counter those benefits. And that's some of the new areas of research we're doing. So if you have artisanal gold mining that's happening in very remote areas where there's forests that are going to be denuded as a result, that is going to have an impact on the carbon budget, because the trees are going to be, of course, taking out carbon out of the atmosphere. So with reference to technologies then, one of the interesting technologies that's really something that also links to a circular economy is how we can use tailings management also to be able to sequester the carbon. And that's one of those technologies which we have profiled in our report, where you can use a technology to convert basically the carbon dioxide can be converted to carbonate rock through various processes in the tailings as well. So there's a range of those that are discussed in the report. I can go into more detail as you desire, certainly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's first of all, I want to differentiate this question about, and this is from my perspective, this question about artisanal mining and large-scale mining, largely because I think the footprints are so distinct. Obviously, we want to decarbonize all mining, but I think that the low-hanging fruit, and this is in terms of decarbonization at scale, will happen on the industrial side. The question, I guess, is how feasible is that? What is the opportunity like, do you think, for industrialized mining, for large-scale gold mining to decarbonize? Is it a challenge? Is it something that we think might be achievable at a rate that is kind of aligned with our aspirations regarding decarbonization?
Yes, no, I think it's definitely possible. I'll just give you some examples of what's been done. So for example, in Nicaragua, just a switch to biofuels or geothermal, it ended up reducing emissions by 44%. So just simple technological changes like that. One of our former PhD students from Australia, Grant Ballantyne, who's now Dr. Grant Ballantyne, is one of the experts in this arena, and he sent me a very up-to-date report in which he's been focusing on comminution within the processing of gold, and just by using a process whereby you don't need steel bearings in the actual grinding, and you use the ore rock itself to do the grinding, you can make the process far more efficient and use much less energy. So, simple things like that, which if put forward through and mainstreamed in the mining industry, can make a huge difference. Use of explosives and how that is managed, the way in which you have the cyanidation process itself carried out, and alternatives to cyanidation, which may be lower carbon footprint. So there's a vast array of these different methods which we discuss in the report, for those who are interested in getting in the weeds, as you said.
Sure, and I was privileged to have a peek at this report, and very good it is too, so I heartily recommend it when it is available for distribution. So I think you mentioned some of those quite specific innovations or changes. And when we looked at modeling this, we looked at 150 odd gold mines in detail, and we've exchanged data. We basically said, okay, there's a lot of work that can be done in energy efficiency, which I think is some of the things you're talking about. Basically, these large industrial processes that for many years were done the same way, now we can start to do them differently. There's also this innovation in terms of using smart tech, Internet of Things, smart sensors. Have you looked at that at all?
Yes, indeed. We did look into that as well with automation and also what we're calling the use of smart grids itself, microgrids, a whole range of computational techniques, which can, a lot of them are also focused on the energy footprint reduction, but certainly the automation process itself can reduce the carbon footprint as well. We looked at even simple things like when you're trying to chart out where to do the blasting, and using computers to optimize the areas that you're using, the shortest transects that are used. So there's a very sort of granular approach to which you can apply smart tech. And it's not just about, like AI algorithms being used for mapping and so on. It's much more at the level of each process being analyzed.
Thank you. So some of this may seem a little detailed for you folks who aren't that interested in gold mining. What I would say is that there are a lot of proof points and evidence that suggest gold mining, certainly industrialized mining, can decarbonize at a rate which is broadly aligned with our global aspirations. And I say that with some confidence, as I say, because we have looked at a lot of mines in some detail. One of the things we mentioned is it's an energy story, and it's a self-generation energy story, but it's also, thank you, it's also a story about grids and basically what you might call passive decarbonization. Did you have any comment just about that ability, either the dependency on decarbonizing the grids, and that will affect everybody because everybody's plugged into a grid somehow.
Yes, yeah.
Unless you're generating your own power. So there's that decarbonization story. Is there anything there you think is worth commenting on?
Yes, no, certainly. So I thought maybe we've got some slides that I thought I'll just share for the audience's benefit. And this is just showing you the different ways in which the decarbonization process can play out in terms of the gold mining efforts, and also just some images which are showing you the ways in which this is being done in various parts of the world. It varies a lot in terms of also what kind of innovation the individual company is willing to make, and this is where also the discussion about what's the role of regulation versus individual corporate action is interesting. I would say in many cases a lot of it has to do with a confluence of the two, but regulation does play a very important role in providing some initial nudge. But each company is able to sometimes go ahead of the curve in doing so. And we looked at some of the major gold mining players, all of the majors more or less we looked at to see what are the different innovations they're doing. So that's the other value added in this report, is we are looking at specific companies to see what are their innovations, not just the macro level case. So we have about maybe 12 case studies in there around that.
Thanks. I'm going to flip that a little and mention that, yes, regulation can give companies and responsible corporate actors a nudge. There are examples of responsible corporate actors actually changing the regulatory environment or pressurizing it. or requesting it to be changed. I often use the case of South Africa, where the miners in South Africa, this is the precious metals miners, were the highest carbon miners in the world because they're plugged into a coal-fired grid. And that coal-fired grid was a monopoly. So you weren't allowed to generate power of a certain scale. In order to decarbonize their operations, they needed to unplug from the grid and be allowed to generate. So by going to the government and saying, we are the highest carbon gold miners in the world, that makes us less investable, and that makes the industry less investable. What you found is the government listened, and the cap to self-generation was gradually raised to the point now you see renewable energy in South Africa. And one of the oldest gold mines in the world, South Deep, now has a large solar array above it. So I mention that because that's a regulatory change which doesn't just impact precious metals and gold mining, it impacts everybody. I mean,
yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, that's where also the gold mining industry in countries where it has such dominance, in places like Ghana, for example, where it can create a leading edge for entire transformation. And that's a very good branding opportunity for the gold industry, you know, in terms of saying, like, often when environmentalists are going to be criticizing you for saying you're mining a metal which is not necessary, as so to speak, you can say, well, you know, in the larger scheme of things, it's that innovation which can drive much broader transformations in society. And so that's a very good point with reference to, especially in Southern Africa, but in West Africa, also in remote areas within the developed world. You know, you could have in remote parts of Canada where you have gold mining, or remote parts of Australia, you could have innovations which can make a big difference in those rural communities and supply them with more sustainable energy sources as well.
I think that's really a good point. We often talk about frontier economies and developing economies and gold's pivotal role, both in the economy and, as I say, in potentially bringing clean energy, but also in Northern Canada and Western Australia, we've seen gold mining play a leading role. Our previous chair would often tell a story that they had no energy available to develop a project, so they developed a hydro project. Fast forward 15 years, and there are 3 hydro projects which are powering the whole region. And that's because by showing leadership, by catalyzing change, you actually have an outsized impact.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, we often talk currently in the climate space about what we call intersectionality with other issues, particularly nature and biodiversity. And so there's often been a long focus on what we call nature-based solutions, the idea you've already mentioned, kind of the idea of building or supporting carbon sinks, carbon sequestration by nature, if you will. These are often linked to the voluntary carbon market and carbon offsets. Do you have anything to say about the kind of potential role of offsets in this decarbonization pathway for the industry?
Yes, certainly. One of my other public service roles is I serve on the United Nations International Resource Panel, and that's under the UN Environment Program. And so we've been looking at ways in which the resource sector can connect with the Convention on Biological Diversity and nature-based solutions. There are different ways in which one can think through this. One is around the offsets that certain mining companies might be doing based on their land assets. One example of that, which is not a gold mining company, but one that's certainly a leader in the larger mining field, is Anglo American, which has very large land assets in Africa. And they've been using a lot of their land for carbon offsets and so on. But if you want to talk about nature-based solutions, from a technical point of view, the area that I see very much promising is, and it's much more at the boutique level currently, very much small scale, is phytomining, where you're using plants to remediate the soil and in some cases extract small amounts of metals. There are plants also which can what they call hyperaccumulate precious metals. Most of this has been done for nickel, but that's considered a nature-based solution in the context of mining. There's also biomining, where there are bacteria that have special accumulation ability for certain metals. And so how we use those, either for remediation of soil or for harnessing the metal itself, that's also being considered in the realm of nature-based solutions.
Okay, so that innovation, that kind of new frontier of science, I think is fascinating. For those of you who watched the World Gold Council's outputs, a year or two ago we produced something called the Golden Thread, which is a little series of documentaries about gold used in innovation, and one of those was microbial use of reclaiming gold in recycling. So it's not mining, but it's the idea of new forms of reclaiming gold from waste product. You mentioned it already, and I'm going to touch upon it, and we don't need to dwell upon it, but you mentioned the informal sector and artisanal gold mining and decarbonization impacts. Is there anything specific that you think might be promising there in terms of the informal sector?
So with the informal sector, this is a much bigger imponderable for especially the Amazon region, because the Amazon, of course, is in a situation where it can be a big part of the solution to climate change if it can be used for sequestration more effectively. And we've had a reversal of some of the gains made in the Amazon in terms of forest loss, again, in the last 5 years increasing, where it was decreasing in the previous decade due to mainly changes in policies in Brazil. The artisanal and small-scale mining sector is considered one of the reasons why that has happened. So a lot of it has to do with cattle ranching, but the problem often happens with roads being built and then greater access for mining, which can then lead to other kinds of derivative land usage. So that's where I think there is a lot of effort being made to try and, on the one hand, provide livelihoods for the artisanal miners, but to do it in a way that you don't have so much forest loss. I see that as potentially a way. It would not be a kind of a net positive outcome, but it would at least reduce the loss that is happening currently. But overall, as your work has also shown, the gold mining sector is not a major contributor to emissions per se in the larger scheme of things, but it's all these other derivative impacts which can make a difference. And we have to look at it not just from the point of view of the emissions, but the sequestration part, because so much of gold mining does happen in forested regions. And one of the things we have done in this report is we've prepared a map, which we're going to update based on your more recent data, where we've looked at where mining is and where there are high levels of forest density. And so that gives us a sense of what may happen in terms of if we don't effectively manage gold mining in forested areas, and that could have a long-term impact in terms of sequestration potential.
Thank you. I'd be remiss, I think, as we're here in Dubai, and you mentioned it already, not to draw attention to COP28. I'll be back here in a few weeks. And I was wondering, I would hypothesize or propose that gold mining itself has actually done a remarkably, a reasonable job, should we say, in showing an awareness and acting on decarbonization. Do you think there's anything that kind of other sectors, other participants at COP might actually learn from the gold sector?
Yes, I think that there's going to be, at COP, there's going to be a lot of effort on climate finance and the ways in which also the gold mining sector can, some of the discussions we've had earlier on in terms of the way gold is used as an asset base itself. There are ecological economists who have suggested in some cases that if you're able to consider the way in which gold prevents people from over-consuming in terms of monetary policy sometimes, that could have certain implications for how climate finance is also managed, which will be an interesting point, because that's going to be one of the major focal areas. That may seem a bit far-fetched, but I mentioned that because it has been noted recently by some economists, including one very radical economist named political economist Jem Bendell. But apart from that, I would also note some of these technologies, especially like the one on tailings, where that's one of the discussions around mitigation is around geoengineering, basically. So the tailings technology, which I showed on one of the slides, we were just kind of putting the slides for you as entertainment while we talked in the background. But that could be used as an example of how many other kinds of industries think about their role in taking carbon out of the atmosphere in a more effective way. So I think the gold mining industry could show that as an opportunity, because a lot of other industries also have these large sort of waste areas in many cases that could be more effectively used with good chemical engineering as a means of carbon sequestration.
Thanks. I'm going to propose my own take on my own question. I was being a bit selfish, but it's moderator's privilege. I would suggest that one of the ways that the gold industry has shown leadership is related to this ability to step in and take action as a responsible corporate citizen, where there is often a lack of resource, capacity, and in many cases, political will. And the reason why I mentioned that is, for me, the shift in the COPs have increasingly been focusing on the issue of what is often termed the just transition, what the transition means for local economies, particularly the global south. And as I mentioned, because the nature of gold mining means it can and often does operate in those areas where otherwise nobody's going to bring that technology, catalyze that change. And I think trying to set an example for other responsible corporate actors to say you need to decarbonize visibly yourself and demonstrate that this is feasible, therefore allowing renewables to be economically viable and encouraging that local capacity. For me, that's kind of a big part.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, any industry which is able to highlight innovations is important overall. And I mean, the gold mining sector generally within the environmentalist community, has a very negative reputation. So I think if you need to do a better job at communicating, especially at places like COP28, where there is going to be a lot of activists present. What are you doing which is going to push the envelope in terms of that kind of innovation, and how that is transferable to other places as well? So, and this is a problem across the mining industry, but gold mining has a particular challenge, because some of the other metals, they are able to say, look, we're using the metal for the green transition. You know, you can have the cobalt miners and the nickel miners, the manganese miners saying we're using them for electric car batteries. With the gold sector, you know, the green tech uses are much smaller. And so I think what you need to do is focus on more your process innovations rather than your product itself, because that'll be a harder case to make.
So let's open the door for me to use a phrase I've been using a lot recently, and that is absolutely gold as a physical material. I don't think we can call it a critical mineral. What I would say is the process of producing gold, the gold value chain, and gold mining in particular, is critical to delivering the transition for the reasons I mentioned. That, as you said, you pointed out in the case studies, the largest solar projects in West Africa are gold mines. The largest hydro projects are gold mines. The ability to show that you can decarbonize industrialized projects are gold mines. You mentioned a few, I think, in the case studies. Agnew in Western Australia now, I think 70% powered by renewables. Kibali in the DRC, in a very remote, difficult region, potentially difficult region, a success story moving, I think, towards 70% renewables. So I think it is critical because those economies would not have renewables, certainly not at scale, without gold mining. I'm told we're out of time, but we did start early, so I was trying to see if Sudesh was giving me a warning sign.
I think questions.
As we started early, are there any questions?
Questions or comments? Welcome.
Apparently not. So, okay. Well, like I say, we're around.
Yes, yep, we'll be around if you have it. And we do have a few copies of the hard copy of the report in draft form. So if any of you are really interested in the topic, I'll be just in the corner here, and you're welcome to come over, and we'll share a draft with you.
I'm going to say one further comment about the relevance of the story of gold mining decarbonizing, and it ties in with that scope 1 and 2 and scope 1 and 2 and 3 issue that was mentioned before. Gold mining is almost unique amongst investable assets. If you decarbonize it at source, you potentially decarbonize the whole value chain and decarbonize the asset. And there's very, very few things on the planet that you can invest in, an investable asset, that don't accumulate further emissions. So gold as an asset, as a low carbon asset, actually is quite significant and unique, and I thought that's worth it. That makes it relevant to all of you, even those not interested in mining. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yep.